Imagine waking up one morning, picking up your rifle, and heading out into the jungle, just like you have every single day for the past 29 years. You check your ammunition, you scan the tree line, you listen for footsteps. The birds go quiet. You wait. This is not a nightmare. This is not a movie. This is Tuesday, March 5th, 1974, on the island of Lubang in the Philippines. And the man doing this, sleeping on the forest floor, eating bananas and stolen rice, fighting a war with absolute conviction, is a 52-year-old Japanese lieutenant named Hiroo Onoda. He does not know that the war ended in 1945. Or rather, he knows the announcements exist. He has seen the leaflets dropped from aircraft. He has read the newspaper clippings left in the jungle for him. He has even heard the voices of his own family broadcast through loudspeakers from the edge of the trees. But he believes none of it. To Hiroo Onoda, every single piece of evidence pointing to Japan's surrender is enemy propaganda, an elaborate years-long deception designed to lure him out of hiding. And because he was trained, deeply, thoroughly, fanatically trained never to surrender under any circumstances, he keeps fighting. For 29 years, 9 months, and several days. This is not a story about a man who was stupid. It is not a story about madness or delusion or blind ignorance. It is the story of a man who was so completely, so perfectly shaped by his beliefs, his training, and his sense of duty that reality itself could not reach him. And when he finally did emerge from that jungle, rifle in hand, uniform pressed, the world watching, the question wasn't just how he survived. The question was, what does it mean to be loyal to something that no longer exists? This is the full story of Hiroo Onoda. To understand Hiroo Onoda, you have to understand the world that made him. He was born on March 19, 1922 in the small village of Kamikawa in Wakayama Prefecture, Japan. He was the third of 6 children in a traditional, deeply patriotic family. His father was a schoolteacher, and from an early age, Hiroo was raised with the values that shaped an entire generation of Japanese men in that era: honor, obedience, sacrifice, and an absolute, unwavering loyalty to the emperor. Japan in the 1920s and 30s was a country in transformation, rapidly industrializing, increasingly militaristic, and burning with a sense of national destiny. The idea of dying for one's country was not just accepted, it was glorified. The warrior class was the highest class. To surrender was not simply defeat, it was shame of the deepest, most unforgivable kind. Onoda grew up breathing this air. At 18, he joined the Imperial Japanese Army and from the very beginning showed a talent for detail, discipline, and tactical thinking. He was sharp, observant, patient. These were not just useful skills, they would become, in the decades ahead, the tools of his survival. By 1944, the war in the Pacific was turning against Japan. The early victories of Pearl Harbor, Singapore, and Bataan had given way to a grinding series of defeats: Midway, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf. The United States was advancing island by island, and Japan was losing ground fast. It was in this context that Onoda was selected for something unusual. He was sent to the Futamata branch of the Nakano School, a covert military intelligence school that trained officers in unconventional warfare, guerrilla tactics, psychological operations, survival behind enemy lines. The school had a motto that might as well have been carved into Onoda's skull: never give up, never surrender, fight until death, or until you receive a direct order to stand down. This was not hyperbole. Officers trained at Nakano were explicitly taught that death in battle was preferable to capture, that surrender was not an option. that they should continue fighting regardless of what they heard, regardless of what appeared to be happening around them, because in unconventional war, the enemy would use every trick, every deception, every psychological tool available to break your will. Remember that teaching. It will become very important. In the autumn of 1944, 22-year-old Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda received his orders. He was to be deployed to the island of Lubang, a small remote island in the Philippines, roughly 75 miles southwest of Manila. His mission was to organize guerrilla resistance, disrupt enemy supply lines, and prevent the enemy from using the island's small airstrip and port. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gave him a direct and formal order before departure. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens will come back for you. You are to stay on this island until we do. Onoda committed those words to memory. He would carry them for the rest of his life. He arrived on Lubang in December 1944. Lubang Island is beautiful in the way that forgotten places often are. Green hills, dense jungle, quiet fishing villages along the coast. In peacetime, it would have been paradise. In 1944, it was a war zone. When Onoda arrived, Japanese forces on Lubang were already under serious pressure. American and Filipino forces were advancing, and within a few months, by February 1945, the island was effectively under Allied control. Most Japanese soldiers on Lubang were killed, captured, or had already retreated. But not Onoda. He withdrew into the jungle with a small group of men: Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, and another soldier named Yuichi Akatsu. Together, they disappeared into the interior of the island. They built shelters from bamboo and leaves. They foraged for food. They rationed their ammunition carefully, and they waited for the counterattack that Onoda was certain would come. It never came. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The most destructive war in human history ended with 2 atomic bombs falling on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Emperor Hirohito's voice, a voice his subjects had never heard before, crackling over the radio in a formal surrender announcement. On Lubang Island, Onoda heard nothing. Or, more precisely, by the time word reached the island, Onoda's training kicked in immediately. Leaflets were dropped from aircraft over the jungle. Onoda found one and read it carefully. His conclusion? Propaganda. The paper's design, the wording, the claims, nothing about it felt authentic to him. The enemy was trying to trick them. This was, in some ways, entirely rational. Psychological warfare was real. Leaflet drops designed to demoralize enemy combatants were a standard tactic of the war. Onoda had been trained specifically to resist this. He had been told in explicit terms that the enemy would try to convince him the war was over. He had been told not to believe it. His training was working exactly as intended. The problem was that this time, it was true. The 4 men stayed in the jungle. By January 1946, Akatsu began to have doubts. He quietly separated from the group and eventually surrendered to Filipino forces. He was repatriated to Japan and debriefed. The Japanese government learned that at least 3 men were still in the jungle on Lubang. A search party was sent, including former Japanese officers, to call them out. They could not find them. Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka saw the search party but concluded it was another trick, or possibly enemy soldiers disguised in Japanese uniforms. They stayed hidden. Over the following years, Japanese aircraft flew over the island and dropped more leaflets. These included official surrender orders from General Yamashita, the commander of Japanese forces in the Philippines. Onoda studied these documents meticulously and found what he believed were inconsistencies. proof, in his mind, that they were forgeries. He kept fighting. The three men raided farms for food. They occasionally ambushed police or military patrols when they believed they were being hunted. Local residents lived in fear. To the people of Lubang, these were not heroes or soldiers, they were a constant, terrifying threat. Over the course of the following decades, Onoda's activities would result in the deaths of at least 30 Filipino civilians and security forces, and the wounding of many more. This is the part of Onoda's story that is rarely told in the romantic versions. This is not a sanitized tale of noble survival. People died because of him. Families were shattered. Farmers were shot. Villages lived in fear for nearly 3 decades. That is the full weight of what his refusal to surrender meant, not just for him, but for the people who shared that island with him. As the years passed, the jungle became their entire world. They tracked the seasons by the rains. They watched the island slowly modernize from a distance. First, electricity in the distant villages. Then, the sounds of motorized vehicles on the roads. They saw the infrastructure of war slowly replaced by the infrastructure of ordinary life. And each change was, to Onoda, further evidence, not that the war was over, but that the enemy was digging in. He could not see what was right in front of him, not because he was blind, but because he had been taught exactly how not to see it. By the mid-1950s, a decade had passed. The world outside had changed enormously. Japan, after the devastation of the war, had undergone an astonishing transformation, rebuilding its cities, developing a new constitutional democracy, experiencing an economic miracle that would eventually make it one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. The samurai culture that had shaped Onoda was fading, replaced by a new Japan that wanted peace, prosperity, and a future disconnected from the militarism of the past. None of this reached the jungle on Lubang. Onoda, Shimada, and Kazuka lived like ghosts. They moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked. They slept in makeshift shelters, often moving before dawn. They collected rainwater. They hunted and fished and stole food when necessary. They maintained their weapons obsessively, cleaning and oiling their rifles, preserving their ammunition, keeping their equipment in functional order. Their uniforms rotted and were replaced with whatever fabric they could find, stitched together by hand. Their boots fell apart. Their bodies bore the marks of years of hardship, leaner, harder, more weathered than any soldier who had fought a conventional war. But they were alive. In 1954, they had a close encounter with a search party that included former Japanese soldiers specifically sent to find them. The party called out through the trees. Onoda watched them through the jungle. He did not move. He did not respond. He waited until they left, then concluded that they were either disguised enemies or Japanese collaborators working for the Americans. In 1959, Akatsu, the man who had surrendered years earlier, was brought to the island along with Onoda's brother, Toshio, and other family members to appeal to them directly. They stood at the edge of the jungle and called Hidoyo's name. They played recordings of his family's voices. Onoda heard them. He was certain it was a trick. They left without making contact. The years continued to pass. Then, on May 7, 1954, the first true tragedy struck. Corporal Shimada was killed in a firefight with a Filipino patrol near the beach. Onoda and Kazuka watched as his body was taken away. They were now 2. This loss should have broken something, and perhaps it did, in ways that are hard to know from the outside. But Onoda's response to grief was the same as his response to everything else. Continue, adapt, survive. The mission was the mission. Onoda and Kazuka spent the next 18 years together. 2 men, 1 island, 1 war that only they were still fighting. In a strange way, they were not entirely isolated from information. They occasionally found newspapers that had been left in the jungle, some deliberately by people trying to reach them. Onoda read these papers carefully. He learned from these newspapers that the Korean War had occurred, that Japan had signed a peace treaty with the United States, that a man named Eisenhower had become American president, that the Tokyo Olympics had taken place in 1964. Each piece of news was filtered through his worldview and reinterpreted. The peace treaty was a temporary ceasefire. Japan would re-enter the war. The Olympics were a distraction, a propaganda tool. The prosperity of Japan was manufactured, a facade. He was not ignoring the evidence, he was processing it, through a lens so thoroughly constructed by his training that the lens itself had become reality. This is what psychologists would later call belief perseverance, the tendency to maintain a belief even in the face of contradicting evidence, especially when that belief is tied to identity and survival. For Onoda, surrendering was not just giving up, it was the destruction of everything he was. Every year that passed made it more impossible, not less. Then, on October 19, 1972, Kazuka was killed. He and Onoda were burning a cache of rice that had been collected by local farmers, a tactic to deny resources to what they saw as an occupying force, when they were ambushed by Filipino police. Kazuka was shot. He died in the jungle, beside the man he had spent 27 years with. Onoda was alone. He buried his companion as best he could. He gathered their shared equipment. He moved deeper into the jungle. He kept fighting. Kazuka's death made international news. The world was stunned. It was 1972. Men had walked on the moon. The Vietnam War was winding down. Japan was an economic powerhouse with bullet trains and televisions and a booming middle class. And yet, here was proof, undeniable physical proof, that a Japanese soldier was still fighting on a remote island in the Philippines, nearly 3 decades after the end of World War II. The Japanese government was embarrassed and fascinated in equal measure. Another search mission was sent. It failed to make contact. And then, a 24-year-old Japanese adventurer and student named Norio Suzuki decided to go looking for Onoda himself. Suzuki was an unusual young man, restless, curious, and possessed of the kind of idealistic boldness that only makes sense when you're in your 20s. He had announced, somewhat whimsically, that his life goals were to find Lieutenant Onoda, a giant panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. He arrived on Lubang in February 1974 with minimal equipment and no official support. He simply walked into the jungle and started looking. And remarkably, he found him. On February 20, 1974, Suzuki came face to face with Hiroo Onoda in the jungle. The encounter could have ended very differently. Onoda was armed and trained to shoot first. But something about this young man, his openness, his lack of threat, his simple and direct manner made Onoda pause. They talked. Suzuki told him the war was over. Onoda, characteristically, said he could not accept this without an order from a superior officer. His commanding officer, Major Taniguchi, had given him his orders. Only Major Taniguchi, or someone of equivalent authority, could release him from them. Suzuki listened. And then, instead of dismissing this as the delusion of a broken man, he did something remarkable. He took Onoda seriously. He flew back to Japan. He found Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who was by then 62 years old and working as a bookseller in a small shop. He explained the situation, and Taniguchi, to his enormous credit, agreed to return to Lubang. On March 9, 1974, Major Taniguchi arrived on the island and made contact with Onoda through Suzuki. The meeting was arranged at a neutral location in the jungle. Onoda came in full uniform, carrying his rifle, his ammunition, and even his old military sword, all in pristine condition. Taniguchi stood before him and read aloud the official order. In accordance with the Imperial Japanese Army's instructions, the Special Squadron of Staff's headquarters is relieved of all military duties. Units which have been assigned to special missions in the Philippines are relieved of those missions. For Onoda, the world stopped. He stood very still. He listened to every word. And then, in his memoir, he described the moment like this. He felt as though everything inside him, every thought, every belief, every reason he had given for 30 years of his life, simply collapsed. He did not cry. He did not shout. He stood there in the jungle on a warm March afternoon, and for the first time in 29 years, Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda laid down his rifle. It was March 9th, 1974. He was 52 years old. The formal surrender took place the following day, March 10th, 1974, at a ceremony at the residence of the Philippine provincial governor. Onoda arrived dressed as sharply as his jungle-maintained uniform allowed. He presented his sword to Ferdinand Marcos, the president of the Philippines, as a symbol of surrender. Marcos, in a gesture that surprised many, immediately returned it, a recognition, perhaps, that this was not the moment for humiliation. The world's press was there. Cameras recorded everything. The images are striking. Here was a man who looked, in many ways, exactly as you might expect a soldier to look, upright, disciplined, his bearing still military, still correct, not broken, not the hollow-eyed survivor of popular imagination, just a man who had done what he believed was his duty and had done it with complete commitment. He was airlifted to Tokyo. Japan didn't quite know what to do with him. He was, simultaneously, a hero and an anachronism. The public reaction was complex. There was enormous admiration for his endurance, his loyalty, his sheer physical survival. There was also deep discomfort because Onoda represented a version of Japan that the country had spent 30 years trying to move past. The fanatical, unyielding militarism that had led the nation into catastrophic war was not something most Japanese wanted to celebrate. The government welcomed him. He received considerable media attention. He met with Prime Minister Kikuei Tanaka. He gave interviews. He wrote his memoirs. But Japan's modern society, with its pacifist constitution and consumer culture and westernized youth, was profoundly alien to him. He found himself unable to connect with it. The values he had lived by, total sacrifice, absolute loyalty, death before dishonor, had no place in this new country. He had come home, but his home was gone. He was also, it must be said, struggling with something harder to name. The weight of what the years in the jungle had cost, not just for him, but for the Filipino civilians who had died, the farmers who had been shot, the families who had suffered. He said in interviews that the hardest thing was learning the true human cost of what he had done, that even if he had genuinely believed the war was ongoing, the pain he had caused was real. Some people in Japan raised funds to send to the families of Filipino victims. It was a gesture, inadequate as all such gestures must be, but it said something about how his story was received. Within a year of returning to Japan, Onoda made a decision that surprised everyone. He left. He moved to Brazil. Brazil had a large Japanese expatriate community, particularly in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul. Onoda bought land there and became a cattle rancher. It was, in many ways, the most rational decision he could have made. Brazil was physically demanding. The land required work, patience, knowledge of weather and soil and animal behavior. It asked of him exactly the skills the jungle had honed: endurance, observation, adaptability, and the ability to exist in a place most people found inhospitable. He thrived. He married a Japanese-Brazilian woman named Machi Onoda, and for the next decade built a quiet, productive life far from the cameras and the complications of Japan. But he did not disappear. In 1980, a Japanese teenager traveling in Brazil was murdered. The case shocked Japan and prompted a national conversation about youth culture, alienation, and the perceived loss of values among younger generations. Onoda, reading about this from Brazil, felt moved to respond. He returned to Japan. Not to stay, but to act. He founded the Onoda Nature School, a camp in the forests of Fukushima Prefecture designed for young Japanese people. The mission was simple and specific: to reconnect children with nature, to teach them endurance and self-reliance, to give them the experience of difficulty and its rewards. It was not a military camp. It was not ideological in any explicit sense, but it was, clearly, Onoda trying to pass on something he believed had been lost: the capacity to endure, to commit, to see something through. Thousands of young Japanese passed through the camp over the years. Many of them spoke, in later life, about how profoundly the experience had shaped them. He continued to split his time between Brazil and Japan for the rest of his life, giving occasional lectures, appearing in documentaries, and engaging thoughtfully with questions about his experience. He never expressed regret for his loyalty, but he did express sorrow, genuine, complicated sorrow for the people who had been caught in the crossfire of his war. Hiroo Onoda died on January 16, 2014, in Tokyo at the age of 91. He had lived long enough to see the 21st century, the rise of smartphones, the expansion of the internet, the transformation of the entire global order. He died as he had lived, quietly determined, deeply private, and carrying within him a story that the world had not finished trying to understand. So what does it mean? The easy version of this story is the romantic one: a man of incredible loyalty and endurance, a soldier who never gave up, a human being who through sheer force of will survived 3 decades in a jungle with almost nothing. And that version is true. The physical facts of his survival are genuinely extraordinary. The discipline required to maintain weapons, stay healthy, and keep a coherent mental framework for almost 30 years, largely alone in a tropical jungle, is beyond what most people can imagine. But the deeper version of this story is harder to sit with. Because Onoda's story is, at its core, a story about what happens when belief becomes more powerful than reality. When the system of meaning that we use to navigate the world becomes so total, so closed, that new information cannot enter. This is not unique to soldiers. It is not unique to Japan, or to 1944, or to war. It is one of the most human things there is. We all have beliefs so fundamental to our identity that questioning them feels like self-destruction. We all have frameworks built by culture, upbringing, experience, and the people we trust through which we filter what we see. And when reality contradicts those frameworks, the first instinct is almost never to update the framework. The first instinct is to find a way to make reality fit. For most of us, this manifests in small ways. We hold on to a relationship too long. We persist in a career that isn't working. We cling to political or social views in the face of inconvenient evidence. For Hiroo Onoda, the scale was different, but the mechanism was the same. His story is also a profound meditation on orders and authority. He was given a direct command by a superior officer, and he followed it with absolute fidelity for 30 years. There is something deeply admirable about that commitment, and something deeply troubling, because the question his story asks, quietly, insistently, is this: what are you obligated to follow, and when does following become its own kind of harm? Onoda was never cruel for cruelty's sake. He was not a sadist. He was not a fanatic in the sense of someone who delighted in violence. He was, by all accounts, a thoughtful and even gentle man in person. He genuinely believed that what he was doing was right, necessary, and honorable. And yet, people died. The Filipino farmers who were shot, the police officers killed in ambushes, the families who lived for 3 decades in the shadow of a ghost soldier in the jungle. Their lives matter too, and their experience of his story is not the heroic one. This is the full complexity of Hiroo Onoda. He was capable of extraordinary devotion, and that devotion caused real suffering. Both things are true at the same time. In the last years of his life, when journalists and documentarians asked Onoda what he wanted people to take from his story, he typically gave quiet, considered answers. He spoke about the importance of commitment, about the value of not giving up, about the power of nature and physical experience in shaping a person's character. He did not, typically, indulge in self-pity or self-aggrandizement. But there was one interview, given late in his life, where he said something that has stayed with me. He was asked whether, knowing everything he knew now, he would do it again. And he paused for a long moment before saying, more or less, "I would follow my orders, but I hope the orders would be wiser." That is a remarkable thing for a man like Hiroo Onoda to say. It does not repudiate his loyalty. It does not deny his experience, but it acknowledges something, some sliver of understanding that the problem was not just with him, that the system which shaped him, which sent him to that island with those orders and that training, bore its own responsibility for what followed. He emerged from the jungle into a world that had moved on, a Japan he did not recognize, a peace he had not chosen, a life he had to reconstruct almost from nothing. And he did it, not with bitterness, but with the same steadiness that had carried him through the jungle. Whether you see Hiroo Onoda as a hero, a tragedy, a cautionary tale, or some strange combination of all three, one thing is certain: there has never been, and will likely never again be, a story quite like his. A man who loved his country so completely that no amount of evidence could convince him it had changed. A man who fought a war that the world had already forgotten. A man who came home 30 years late and chose, quietly, to begin again. His rifle is in a museum now. The jungle where he hid has grown back over whatever traces he left. And the island of Lubang looks from the sea exactly as it always has, green and quiet and beautiful, giving nothing away. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe for more stories about the extraordinary people who fell through the cracks of history. And leave a comment. What do you think of Hiroo Onoda? Hero or something more complicated?